So, in the middle of my last video where I talked about the destruction path in Honkai Star Rail, I asked my viewers if they would like a video fully centered around Kafka and her unique take on the DPS archetype, since I left her out for simplicity's sake. And while no one commented if they were interested, that video did so well that I'm making this video anyways. Thank you all so much for the support, by the way. All the likes, comments, and subscriptions mean the world to me. We're getting ever closer to that 1,000 subscriber goal, and I greatly appreciate all the support, man. I really do. But back to Kafka. While I was making this video, I posted a poll on my community page asking my viewers if they had Kafka and whether or not they enjoyed using her, and I was utterly shocked at the results. Granted, it's a small sample size from a small YouTube channel, but I was surprised at how even the like to dislike ratio was for the Stellar Hunter, at least at the time I took the screenshot. Roughly 44% of the responses either don't have her and have no interest in getting her, or have her and don't like using her. A stark contrast to the month of her release where she was just everywhere on social media. So in this video, I'll break down what DOTs are, how Kafka utilizes them to become such a unique and unconventional DPS in the game, and why some players may or may not like her playstyle despite how effective it's proven itself to be. Let's get into it. So let's break down the main mechanic that Kafka abuses in her kit. DOTs. So DOT is a type of damage dealt through certain debuffs at the beginning of a target's turn, before they take their action. Unlike regular damage, DOTs cannot score critical hits. I repeat, DOTs cannot score critical hits. There are 4 types of DOTs in the game: bleed, burn, shock, and wind shear, corresponding to physical, lightning, and wind damage respectively. Note that the additional damage dealt by Ice's Frozen and Quantum's Entanglement are not considered DOTs, despite being dealt at the beginning of the target's turn. Why that's the case, your answer's as good as mine, because I honestly don't know. A balancing reason, I don't know. Shock and burn are simple. They deal lightning or fire damage on the target at the start of their turn. Wind shear, on the other hand, starts out pretty weak but can be stacked multiple times on a target to exponentially increase the wind damage the target takes at the start of their turn. Bleed's damage is calculated using a percentage of the target's maximum HP. So there are 2 main sources of DOTs: certain characters' abilities and weakness break. I'll refer to these as normal DOTs and break DOTs because each one is calculated differently. For example, a shock DOT that was inflicted from Serval's skill or ultimate will deal a different amount of damage than a shock that was caused by weakness breaking a lightning weak enemy. What's important to note is that these DOTs are counted as separate entities. So for example, an enemy can have 3 different versions of shock on them, one from Serval's skill or ultimate, a second from Kafka's talent or ultimate, and a third from suffering a lightning weakness break. And all 3 of these can be manually triggered by Kafka's skill and ultimate, but more on that later. So for the sake of brevity, I'll just say that the bleed DOT is the one best suited for high HP enemies like most bosses, and characters like Sampo and Serval in the game right now can make wind shear and shock very effective for dealing with mobs. If you want a deeper breakdown of DOTs, check out this video by Sevi that breaks the mechanics down much further than I can. It's a great watch, trust me. So the DOT-focused gameplay style existed before Kafka's release, but it took on a much more proactive identity after Kafka's release, and it's all thanks to her kit. Her ultimate is where the show begins. It deals up to 80% of her attack to all enemies and has a 100% base chance to apply shock for 2 turns. In addition to this, enemies will also instantly take a damage instance from said shock upon application, a whopping 290% of Kafka's attack stat at max trace level. And with her final trace unlocked, her ultimate will then trigger all stacked DOTs on the enemy, including the previously added shock, for up to 104% of their damage. Yes, all of them. Her skill continues the mayhem that her ultimate began by dealing damage to a target enemy as a blast AoE, hitting adjacent foes as well. And if the enemy you targeted has DOT debuffs on them, they will all immediately deal up to 75% of their original damage. Yes, all of them. Remember what I said earlier about weakness break DOTs and ability DOTs being separate entities? That means that Kafka's skill and ultimate can trigger all of them each time they're used. Kafka's talent is also a useful DOT tool. When any ally uses a basic attack on an enemy, like Sampo or inevitably any support character like Natasha, Kafka will instantly perform a follow-up attack onto that target, dealing up to 140% of her attacks as damage, and having a 100% base chance to apply the same shock debuff as the one on her ultimate. She only gets to do this once per turn, but considering you're going to have some of your other teammates basic attacking a lot, this is pretty much guaranteed to be used at every available instance. But what exactly makes Kafka an anti-meta DPS? Well, for starters, there's no need for crit stats on her. Like I mentioned earlier, all DOTs cannot crit against enemies. At all. This means that there is no point in investing in crit stats on all of the DOT characters on her team. Instead, the focus stats are attack and speed. A lot of attack and speed, but not too much speed, as it's very important that Kafka's teammates that apply DOTs to the enemy go before Kafka, so that she isn't using her skill without proccing any additional DOTs. So, from a certain perspective, this could mean that Kafka's damage output is more consistent than other traditional DPSs like Seele and Genuine, because her damage floor and ceiling isn't determined by the dice roll that is the crit rate stat, and isn't limited by the crit damage stat. However, an enemy's defense stat and elemental res stat is still used to determine how much damage a DOT does when it's triggered. So characters like Pila and Silverwolf, who can reduce these stats, are highly valued in DOT teams. Speaking of which, the second thing that makes Kafka such an unconventional DPS is the unconventional teammates that she needs in order to get her job done. For starters, there's Luca. Luca's entire kit revolves around applying bleed to enemies and then triggering that bleed using his enhanced basic attacks in order to deal a great amount of single target damage. So Luca's bleeds provide Kafka DOT teams with a massive boost in single target enemy scenarios. Kafka can trigger not only Luca's bleed, but also any physical break bleeds he applies. He also has a damage taken increase debuff as part of his ultimate, which amplifies DOT damage that the enemy takes, greatly benefiting himself and Kafka. On top of that, while not necessarily being skill point positive, Luca himself doesn't require many skill points in order to function, which makes it easier to build the double DOT DPS team with him as a member. What Luca brings to the table in regards to single target damage for DOT teams, Sampo brings to the table for multi-target DOT teams. Sampo applies a lot, and I mean a lot, of stacks of wind shear to multiple targets at once using his skill, his ultimate, and even his basic attack if need be, because all three have the exact same base chance to inflict wind shear for 3 turns. It's his talent after all. Sampo significantly amps up Kafka's AoE damage potential. He has no issue ramping his DOTs up quickly, but most importantly, keeping them active the entire fight on all priority targets. His ultimate increases the damage enemies take from DOTs further, which improves his own and Kafka's damage. On top of that, Kafka is very skill point efficient, as his basic attack, like I mentioned earlier, also apply wind shears, so you don't always need to constantly spam his skill to help the team. So Saval is another fantastic choice for a teammate for Kafka, because her entire kit revolves around indefinitely extending the duration of the shock DOTs inflicted on the enemy, even the weakness break version, by using her ultimate. Kafka can then repeatedly trigger these shock DOTs inflicted by herself and Saval using her skill and ultimate, leading to a ton of lightning DOT damage being dealt to the enemy. And remember what I said earlier about how an enemy's defense stat and elemental res stat is still used to determine how much damage a DOT does when it's triggered? That was the main reason why Pila and Silverwolf are also fantastic choices for teammates for Kafka, because Pila can provide a massive amount of defense shred in order to greatly amplify DOT damage. And as an added bonus, she's very skill point positive and can also freeze enemies in a pinch and rip off any buffs that they have on them. Silverwolf is one of the most popular partners used with Kafka because of her ability to implant weakness into enemies. So it's very easy to break enemies for lightning while Silverwolf is Kafka's teammate. She also provides a great amount of defensive utility with her bugs and the ability to break for quantum in a pinch, on top of supplying her own version of defense shred and an incredible damage multiplier for DOT teams. The Kafka DOT team is definitely unorthodox compared to the traditional team comps in Honkai Star Rail, but when you get things set up properly and you let that ult rip, just take a look.
Does that sting?
All you got.
Who will it be? Getting hurt?
The punches decide. Get cocky.
Say bye to breathing. Time for a shot. Stand still.
Small fry.
Just a little something. Think nothing.
I owe you one. Step out of it. Where's the applause? Let's see some sparks fly!
Good times never last. Time to say bye. Boom.
What are you waiting for? To betray my customers? I charge extra.
Honestly, with all the things in Kafka's favor, I'm shocked at how low revenue her banner had while it was active. Granted, it's not terrible. 16.8 million from China's iOS market alone is not a small amount of money. It's almost the same amount as Shenhe and Zhao's rerun banner and Genshin version 2 by comparison. But without counting Fu Xuan, because her banner hasn't finished at the time of this video, Kafka's banner was the second worst performing banner so far, which was definitely lower than I personally expected it to do. Granted, the low amount of revenue could be due to most players saving a ton of free pulls prior to her release and thus not needing to spend any cash for more. Actually, thinking about it out loud, that's probably the exact reason it did so poorly. However, it could also be because of how unconventional of a DPS she is. In other words, the things that make Kafka stand out from the other DPS characters are exactly what makes some players not jive with her. Brutal Terminator commented on one of my community posts that the DOT playstyle just isn't for them, and that's totally fine. Even with Kafka on the roster, DOT teams definitely have a more passive playstyle compared to other traditional team comps in Honkai Star Rail right now. And I won't lie, there's nothing else more satisfying than the classic strategy of stuffing your DPS unit with as many buffs as they can fit, and then watching them deal a ridiculous amount of damage from their attacks that score lucky critical hits every single time, because of course they do. Also, some of the teammates that Kafka currently rely on for success are rarely used in other teams. So from some players' perspective, why waste resources building them for this one specific team and nothing else? Especially if you don't particularly like those characters to begin with. Sampo, I'm talking to you. Now, in terms of how future-proof of a DPS character Kafka is, I personally believe she's in a similar situation as Silverwolf, in my personal opinion. Her mere existence basically reinvented the DOT playstyle. Unless the character is released into the future that literally just does everything Kafka does but better, and there's no value gained from using both of them together on the same team like with Yelan and Xingqiu and Genshin, Kafka is going to retain a ton of value as a unique anti-meta DPS character in the Honkai Star Rail for a long time. And I believe there's two main reasons for this. One is that there will inevitably be more DOT characters arriving in the future. It hasn't even been a full year into Honkai Star Rail's existence at the time of me making this video. It's inevitable that more DOT-focused characters with their own DOT mechanics will be added to the game in the future, and every single one of them will have some form of synergy with Kafka. More characters means more teams that can be made that will be solutions to different problems that DOT-focused teams encounter. Without going on too long of a tangent, this is why I personally value having new characters far above additional copies of the same characters, or even additional high-rarity weapons or light cones for them to use. The mere existence of Kafka jump-started Sampo's usage rates because of how valuable he is at enabling Kafka to deal with enemy mobs with her DOTs. And I'm almost certain that Luca's Bleed and Physical Break focused kit wouldn't have been so well received if he didn't release alongside the Stellar Hunter. More characters equals more options means more potential solutions to different problems. It's that simple. But back on topic, I also believe that it's inevitable that more defensive enemies will be added for her DOT teams to abuse in the future. It's also worth noting that DOTs are a defensive enemy's bane of existence. Take for example Boss Japard in Simulated Universe World 3. Who demonstrates the main reason why Fu Xuan needs a debuff cleanser on her team. During the second and third phase of the fight, he activates a shield that absorbs a large amount of damage that is inflicted to himself and his allies. Neither he nor his allies can suffer a weakness break while their shield is up either. He is going to get a ton of turns while their shield is in play. But with the Kafka DOT team, you can just let him. Since the total amount of damage the shield can absorb is shared between Japard and his allies, inflicting DOTs on all three is a very potent strategy, especially when using the Nihility path in Simulated Universe. Just stuff them all full of DOTs, especially bleed, trigger them multiple times using Kafka's skill and ultimate, and simply wait for that shield to come crumbling down.
We stand together in the name of preservation! We're just having fun.
Say bye to breathing. Good times. Now time to say bye. Boom.
Give up.
More enemies with a defensive playstyle like Japard could be added in the future, and for each and every one that's added, that's more increased value that Kafka DOT teams will have. Hey, so real quick, I'm just going to throw in one last thought that I had about Kafka and her role as a character in this game before I go. Apologies if this part sounds a bit less edited or scripted. This is kind of just coming off the dome. What I like the most about Kafka as a DPS character is how she sort of breaks the mold of expectations of what types of characters were going to be on the Nihility path. The Nihility path is all about applying debuffs to enemies, whether it's like attack debuffs, defense debuffs. In the case of Silver Wolf, it's literally implanting additional elemental weaknesses onto enemies. Kafka could have easily just followed this trend as a Nihility character, but no, she utilized the Nihility path in her own unique way in order to become a DPS character for that path. And again, I like how that sets her apart from all of the other DPS characters in the game right now that are on the Hunt, Erudition, and Destruction paths. But also, it just goes to show how just because a character is on a specific path, it doesn't mean that they have to tread to that path's rules so strictly, if that's the right way of putting it. I got a lot of comments on my destruction path video. I made my theory, I guess that's the right term for it, that the destruction path was going to be more focused on high risk, high reward DPS in the future. And I got some comments that agreed with me, and I also got comments that disagreed with me and also mentioned that there are also destruction characters that fit more in line with the bruiser archetype, which is all about, you know, tanking damage and then dishing it back out, such as like physical trailblazer and Hook, due to her ability to like heal from damage and stuff like that. So yeah, this goes to show that just because a character is on a specific path doesn't mean that they have to strictly align with that path's I guess mechanics, so to speak. So while Kafka herself is on the Nihility path, she isn't just about applying debuffs. She's also about utilizing the debuffs that are on the enemy to drastically increase her own damage output. And I really like how that sets her apart from other characters in the game right now. And it also just opens the door wide open for other characters that take a little bit from multiple paths in order to carve their own niche in the meta. I mean, hey, who knows? Maybe we'll get a Harmony DPS character in the future. Oh wait, technically we already do have one, Yukong. That's funny. I believe this video's been going on long enough, so I think I'm just going to end things off here. But let me know down in the comment section below, how do you feel about Kafka? Do you like her playstyle? Do you like her character? And if you don't, what is it about her character or the DOT playstyle that makes Kafka awkward to get used to compared to other DPSs? Like, comment, and subscribe for more content. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.